Maaza, it's so great to see you, and in such wonderful circumstances. These sad days bring little joy, but to know that you are on the short list of this prize pleases me immensely. When did you hear that you were on the short list?
I heard actually just a couple of days ago. I'm so excited. You know, this Premio means a lot to me. Santa Maddalena was a place where this novel began. Um, my conversations with Beatrice have really informed my perceptions of people who were involved in the war. It feels special to be on the short list. And for the last 2 days, I've been absolutely thrilled. But of course, Alberto, getting the chance to talk to you now too was one of the things that I was really looking forward to.
I thought you would be so blasé after being on the short list for the now this. What else? The Nobel Prize next?
Somehow I doubt it. Somehow I doubt it. But I no, this was very far from blasé. I'm really excited. It means something. This is how you and I started a conversation years ago at one of the premios. So it means a lot.
You started writing this novel after your first novel, which was a great success, was a wonderful work of art. How did you start this one? They say that starting a second novel is much more difficult than starting the first.
They are right. They are right, because I think this novel had a lot of starts, and I used to think that the beginnings, the things that I didn't like, the revisions that I had to make were false beginnings and bad beginnings. But I think now I realize that I had to write my way into the form that this book took. I couldn't have jumped all those other steps. It has been really a process with the book. And as long as I have known you, I think we have been talking about different books, literature, ideas, different philosophies to writing, and all of that has informed this. It was really a result of years of conversation and reading.
In the case of your first novel, you had a story in mind, and you wrote it, and it turned out well, very well. In the case of the second novel, did you know what the Shadow King would be about? Did you know what you wanted to say?
Not initially. Initially, I thought that I was just writing a story about war, that I was writing in the service of history. I wanted to retell this history through fiction. And I think that there was a first draft of this book that was really a play-by-play of certain battles and certain historical events, and my characters were moving through that. But at some point, I knew that I wasn't really writing about war. I was writing about something else, and it took a while to understand that I was writing about memory. And the war and these characters were the way that question, whatever it was I was asking about memory, they were being draped over that. But the real essence of this is something I was wondering about memory. And once I figured out, my question is, how much of the past is always in present moments? How much do we carry with us? And what does it mean to remember? And is it possible to truly, really forget anything? Then I realized, my God, then I can restructure this book. I can do something interesting, because what is memory but the imagination moving in different places all at once? And that helped me. That really, it made the book more fun that way. And when I started writing it again.
Fun is not an adjective that I would associate with the book.
I know.
You told me of a moment, a very important moment in this process, where looking at photographs that your family kept, you came across the photograph of a woman armed with rifles, and you began to ask who that was. Oh, tell us about that moment.
This was a photograph. I started while I was writing this book, even before I was writing this, when I was writing my first book, I was collecting photographs taken by Italians during this war. I was interested initially just in collecting images. I didn't know why I was doing it. I didn't really have a sense of what I would do with it later. But as I started developing the story, I started going back to these images. I had always thought this was a war fought by men. I thought that the story was pretty clear cut of a David and Goliath story, a poorly equipped Ethiopian army rising up against a European force and winning somehow. And that, I thought, was the story I would tell. And then I stumbled upon this photograph of a woman in uniform with her rifle, a pistol, and I thought, wait a minute, who is she? And what is she doing there? This is not a story that my family had ever told me. I didn't know. And then
Because
once
these were family photos, so it's not photos from some anonymous archive.
These were photos from just an archive, that one that I had found. But Alberto, that you were right in the fact that this photo led me to women, but I did not know until much later. It was because of this that I discovered my great-grandmother had been part of this war. She had been a young girl, relatively young, and had gone to enlist in this war. I had never heard this story. I had only heard about the men in my family. And if I didn't have that photo, if I hadn't found that photograph, I don't think I would have ever heard about my great-grandmother. This was just something no one thought it was important enough to talk about.
It takes a fiction writer to tell us what is important. I'm amazed by the ease with which you open up a territory that was completely unknown to someone like myself. Ethiopia meant the Queen of Sheba, and that's where things stopped for me. And you managed to present the history and the character of the people, the identity of the people in such a convincing way. Were you worried because you were choosing a subject that was not familiar to a Western audience?
I was really worried about my ability to convey the people as complex human beings. I was worried that I did not know enough about them, because I was realizing that my vantage point of living in New York City, having been in America for a number of years, having been born in Addis Ababa, which is very far from the village, that I would not know what life was like, and I couldn't convey human beings there. I was very frightened of not even being able to portray it for me, much less anyone else. And so I had to take the process of writing and the research, but really the process of writing step by step, moving closer and closer into their interior, over a lot of revision out of time. It took me sitting with a scene for I don't know how long, saying I have to chisel away now and move past what they do to what they felt when they were doing it. And I realized along the way that these people, no matter where they were born or how they lived, were as complicated as anyone would be today living in a city.
And it's complicated also by the shifting point of view. You have such an extraordinary ability to take the characters out of what could be a two-dimensional universe and turn them into something that has 20 dimensions. I introduced to Hirut, we introduced to Aster, introduced to Kidane, and then later to Ettore. And every time we think that this is now we are coming to the center of the novel, and that shifts, and you trick us, and you offer this complexity. Were you doing this deliberately, or did you find that in going to another character, you had to shift the reality of the previous ones?
That's a really good question. That shift and the continual shifts that I made in the book had a lot to do with what my understanding of history. I came to understand that history is really just a series of narratives, often told by people who are fallible, who have their own biases, who sometimes have bad memories. And what do we do with that? How do you write a historical account when those accounts are biased and and often leave out things? And this is where the structure came for writing it with these different voices, different perspectives. The chorus that comes in and pushes against a character's
brilliant
remembrance. Thank you. I enjoyed doing those parts. The chorus gave me flexibility, and it let me do things with trying to think about who deserves to be remembered in history, who are the ones that we've tended to forget, and can the chorus push against and maybe even take part in some of that forgetfulness? It gave me I know fun is not the word, but I really did enjoy writing those parts.
This leads me to the world of Greek theater, but mainly to the world of Greek epics, because am I correct in remembering that you were reading the Iliad at the time?
Mm-hmm.
And so in the Iliad, you have exactly that. You have the shifting points of view. It's the story of Greek triumph, but you take pity on the Trojans, and the women appear as more important characters than the men sometimes. Was the Iliad a direct inspiration?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I have liked the Iliad since the moment I read it in high school. I have gone through several translations of it. The presence of the chorus was obviously an influence, but also the way that Homer focused on loss in this story of war, focused on the friendships. The focus was on what was happening to the people, not the larger questions of necessarily why but what was happening to these people as they were running across the field, how they were being hurt, who was crying out for what. I found that to be revelatory. But what was also interesting to me with the Greek tragedies and in particular the epics and the presence of the chorus in those is that when I was a child and I came to the United States, and I was really trying to find literature that could speak to me in some way, I found American culture in sometimes very narrow. When I picked up Homer and when I picked up the Greek tragedies, Alberto, and I would see Ethiopia or Ethiop. As a child, I said, this is me, there I am. Yeah, and I fell in love with those stories. The presence of the,
No, but I'm sorry, I shouldn't interrupt.
The presence of the chorus echoed for me the Ethiopian Asmari, which were I guess we might call them the griots or the troubadours, but they are the people in the village who would remember what battle happened, for example, sing it for generations so that those people became remembered. And this is how history was passed down. And I realized this is a chorus. This is Ethiopia. We've been doing this for millennia across cultures. And I recognize that too.
You mentioned that you came as a child to North America. I know you as a New Yorker. And were you ever tempted to write a New York story or an American story, since you are American?
It has always, to me, seemed like one of the most boring things I could do is to do a story on New York or on me. I think my first book, I thought, just God, do an immigrant story. You don't have to do the research. You could just write this. And I would look around and those books were popping up everywhere. And I thought, I don't think there's anything I can add to what somebody else is saying. And I tend to keep gravitating towards the past. And that's where my imagination comes alive. Whereas the idea of New York feels to me overdone. It's processed. It holds no interest for me.
There is another a landscape that holds your interest, that sparks your interest, which is Italy. You have written about death in Italy. You have written about the tombs in Italy, and of course, Italy in the conflict with Ethiopia is apparent in both your novels. So what attracts you to Italy? Is it just the relationship to Ethiopia, or is it something deeper?
I think it's something about the culture that echoes. It's familiar to me in some of the ways that religion has been very important. The family and community is very important. There's a musicality to language that I find is absent in English, that is in Italian, and it is in Amharic and some of the other languages spoken in Ethiopia. I remember the first time that I watched the film Cristo si è fermato a Eboli and read Carlo Levi's book, and the villagers in the village where he was in the 1930s, it could have been Ethiopia. The way that they lived, the way that religion is central, everything, the superstitions, the rituals, that was Ethiopia. And I imagine that men from the South who went to fight in Ethiopia, I think had to have recognized parts of their own culture there.
But Ettore is not from the South. Ettore is Venetian.
Yes.
Why did you choose Ettore as a Venetian? Is it because of the Jewish connection?
And it was because of the Jewish connection. It was because I knew a bit about the history of Venetian Jews during the Nazi occupation, but also in the 30s. And I wanted to represent that part of Italian history. And I've been to Venice several times, and I thought this is an interesting place to set this.
Interesting. Yes,
Yeah.
interesting. It's a small village, but you will be amused by its pretensions.
Absolutely.
Have you ever thought of living in Italy?
I have. It would be wonderful. I think, this pandemic, Alberto, obviously we've talked about this, has broadened my perspective of what's possible, where one can live and exist and work and all of that. The realities of unfortunately, employment at this point means that I have to stay here because we're moving away from online back to in person. But if it was possible, I think Italy would be an interesting place to live.
Do you read a lot of Italian literature?
I try. Yes, I am, and I'm trying. I am continuing that because I want to improve my reading capacity in Italian, and all of these grammatical rules that are different when you speak. You can just swim over them, but when you're reading or writing in it, it's a different story, and I'd like to master that more.
Ethiopia is a theme in 20th century Italian literature, and even a little before. Do you find it interesting to see the other point of view, or is it another point of view?
I think that it's the Ethiopia as something beyond just a metaphor for Italians is starting to be recognized. I think in the past, Ethiopia was a mythic place, maybe not necessarily concrete. And I think that there some of the writings that have been in Italy that have dealt with Ethiopia, and maybe the most famous one might be Ennio Flaiano's Time to Kill, Tempo Uccidere, which is a really beautifully written book. But Ethiopians are silent in that. And in some ways, it's very much an Italian book for Italy. And I think now that Ethiopia is becoming more complicated. It's people have studied more about it. There are more conversations. There are more East African Italians in Italy, and they are writing things that are creating a more nuanced perspective of Ethiopia and East Africa, and that's really good to see.
I'm not clear as to what Ethiopia stands for in Africa. I am much more clear as to that, what you call the mythical image of Ethiopia, and then the real warm Ethiopia vis-a-vis Italy. But in Africa, what is Ethiopia standing?
Well, I think Ethiopia has been mythic for Africans as well. This was a country that fought against colonialism not once, but twice, that remained independent. It galvanized Africans in their quest against colonial forces. It was a point of inspiration for African Americans in the 1930s who were resisting the Jim Crow laws. Garveyites saw Ethiopia and Haile Selassie as this beacon of freedom. Bob Marley made Haile Selassie and Ethiopia famous in those songs. I think Ethiopia has always been a myth. It's always been rendered in one way or another without actually looking at the complexities of that country. And I think even within Ethiopia, those myths have been alive. And now, without getting too much into it, now we're seeing this unrest in Ethiopia, I think the world is beginning to see that there have been deep divisions based on ethnicity. There have been these deep chasms, and Ethiopia is as real with all its very real problems as any other place.
Absolutely. You have given Ethiopia, your Ethiopia, in your novels, another mythical quality. Myth is, as you know, not equivalent to a lie or something that doesn't exist, but myth elevates reality to something that is meaningful for everyone. And I think you have done that. And do you think you will continue to do that? Is that your chosen territory?
That's a good question, Alberto. I think now that I've done these two books and I have worked with two moments in history that have always fascinated me, I'm giving myself the freedom now to move and roam and see where it goes. I'm not cornering myself into, only writing about Ethiopia. You and I just completely over the years have talked about several ideas, several concepts and subjects, and those are things that I'm ready now. I needed to get this book out of my system.
What I found so marvelous, well, one of the things I found so marvelous about The Shadow King, I was saying the variety of characters and the variety within each character, but Kidane in particular, as the male character of that trinity with Hirut and Aster, you don't know who he really is. It's wonderful because depending whether he's with Aster, his wife, or whether he is with Hirut, this young woman that he is helping from the family that he knew. Was that in terms of your idea of mythical, a representation of the mythical Ethiopian man, or simply the masculine figure in the war?
Absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned him. He was one of the more difficult characters to crack in some way. I found this character and this type of personality so wrapped up in his own ideas of what masculinity is, what manhood means. He seemed so invested in the male lineage that he came from that it was hard for him to see himself outside of that. And so it was difficult for me to see him outside of that. But I think anytime I put him in front of those two women and then had them push against him in one way or another, he revealed himself a little bit more. He was one of the tough ones, though, to really write about.
You know, he reminded me of the several male characters in D.H. Lawrence who come to life when they are confronted with the women, and in different ways, depending on what woman. But Ettore is a different male character. And your interest in history and how memory alters history and tells different stories is reflected in the photographer, who it's a different kind of memory. What can you say about photography as memory?
When I was collecting those photographs taken in Ethiopia by Italian soldiers, and in particular when I would discover their albums, when I would stumble across those and look at the way they arranged their albums, the kinds of photographs they put, the order that they put them in, I realized that the images that they were making in Ethiopia were intended to help them remember themselves and their time in Africa in a very particular way. The albums were often carefully curated. They told they weren't necessarily about Ethiopia. It was about this particular man in this moment of his youth. And I found that a fascinating way to consider how photographs shape and reshape memory, so that the omissions become less apparent unless you know what's happening outside of the frame. And that the stories, the narratives that these photographs are supposed to tell are actually only part of the story. I could look at those moments as an Ethiopian, and sometimes I would know exactly the location where an image was made, because it would have the location, it would have the date in an album. And I would know that that peaceful, idyllic image is a far cry from what was happening just over the hill. And that helped me begin to develop some of those photography scenes in the book. My subjects now, those people who were being photographed by Italians, they could speak back to what was not being photographed, because I knew what wasn't being photographed. The photographs were really fascinating items for me to consider as a visual narrative.
The novel is an echo chamber of voices and images that speak to one another and transform one another in that ongoing dialogue. For me, it also has to do with your notion of telling the truth through fiction, telling the truth through photography. How did it affect your idea of what the fiction writer does, telling a story of something that really happened?
I realized that as many voices as I included in the book, as many ways as I tried to upend my own telling of it by having the chorus come in and offer another perspective, as many times as I did that, there were still layers that had not been told, that this is just one small retelling. And there are hundreds, millions more. This history has been an absolutely fascinating one to be immersed in. This questions people ask me now, the descendants of people both on the Ethiopian side, but also on the Italian side, has opened up more paths into this history. There was a woman, a Jewish Italian woman, who contacted me recently, telling me about a camp that her mother and her grandmother had been put in, and said, do you think they kept children? Did they keep Jewish people in these camps? And it was something I had never heard of, and she had photographs. And now here's a whole other history of what was happening in Eritrea, but this was a camp. And there's so many histories. People asking me, can you help me find so-and-so who was taken to this Italian prison? And so there's so many more stories still out there.
This is the difference between catechism and fiction. Fiction doesn't give one story, doesn't give one answer. And you have constructed such a marvelous historical edifice in which we will wander for many, many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Because it is such an extraordinary novel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alberto. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.